Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Thanks so much for being here with us today. My name is Kathleen Kuo, and I am a program manager for Nevada Humanities, our state's council partner for the National Endowment for the Humanities. With Humanities at Play, our goal is to pair gameplay and other interactive activities with thoughtful discussions about the humanities and how they shape and enrich our everyday lives. So, throughout the end of 2024, Nevada Humanities is producing a series of Humanities at Play events that are part of United We Stand, Connecting Through Culture, which is a joint initiative of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts to leverage the arts and humanities to combat hate motivated violence through programs that deepen public understanding of and contextualize community, state, and national history and foster cross cultural understanding, empathy, and community resilience. So today, I am so excited to be continuing our discussion and introduction to Loreloop, the world we live in, the world we create. This is an original tabletop role-playing game and collection of short stories at Nevada Humanities. And our featured guest today, Ashley Warren, have been working on for, oh gosh, like the last year and a half, I think. Last year or so. It's been, time flies,
Yeah,
Ashley.
I know. I've been thinking just about how long this has been in the works. Like, I guess in the scheme of things, it hasn't been that much time for how much we are producing. Like, I think people are going to be astounded by how big of a book Loreloop is. But yeah, it's been I think about a year and a half at this point. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's
cannot
been
believe
a lot of
it.
fun. Yeah.
So, this game is going to be made available and free and available to public. I like to emphasize the free because we've gotten questions like, how
Hmm.
much will this cost? Nothing. We are so excited to. This is just for anyone who loves games, loves Nevada, loves history, and wants to join in the world of and fun of Lore Loop. This is going to be free on the Nevada Humanities website at the end of 2024. So, for those of you who don't know Ashley, I'm going to read her bio for you all. So, Ashley Warren is an award winning writer and narrative designer who has developed, produced, and co authored numerous best selling titles for Dungeons and Dragons, including the Uncaged anthology series, Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden, Hecna, and Legend Lore. She serves as a director of the Storytelling Collective, which is a global online writing program for independent creative storytellers. Ashley is best known for her immersive atmospheric storytelling that she lends to both games and fiction. She is passionate about exploring the themes of culture, identity, and folklore in her work. She holds a master's in literacy studies from the University of Nevada, Reno, and as I mentioned above, she is the writer and the narrative designer for Lore Loop, The World We Live in, The World We Create, which is our original tabletop role playing game. So today, this is part two of our conversation about Loreloop. Part one, I believe, is available on YouTube, and this is where we chatted more about the conception and development of this game. So if you're interested after watching today's stream, you can go back and find that conversation on YouTube, and I hope you check it out. But don't be shy about asking any questions you might have about Loreloop if you have them today in chat. But we are going to walk through the creation of an original character for Loreloop in what's commonly known as a session zero. And Ashley, I'm wondering, what do players and game masters do during a session zero? What is a session zero?
Sure. So a session zero serves two purposes. It serves a purpose for the group, and it serves a purpose for the game itself. So basically, your session zero is the opportunity for anyone who's about to play usually a long-term game together, which is called a campaign in the tabletop world, to basically create characters, discuss the dynamic of the table, to discuss a little bit about the campaign in terms of like its themes and I would say like some major story beats, but nothing about like the nitty gritty things that you're going to be doing. So you're establishing expectations for how you're going to interact with each other as your characters. You're establishing how you're going to interact with each other as people. And I can talk a little bit more about that aspect of a session zero. But it's basically just to kind of set the expectations for the adventure that you're about to go on with a bunch of other people. If you are the facilitator of the game, this is your chance to kind of get to know your players and to get to know the characters that they want to play, and to learn about their character goals and motivations and to get that information so you can incorporate it into your storytelling. And then if you're a player, this is a chance to figure out who you're going to be embodying throughout this adventure, because your character is what gives you your motivations for the decisions and things that you're going to be doing. And those decisions are fundamental to a tabletop role-playing game. That's what makes it a role-playing game. So this is where you get to learn your own character and figure out their special traits and characteristics and really think through who you want them to be and how you plan to explore that their identity in your upcoming game. So those are kind of the basics of a session zero and some of the things we'll be doing today.
I'm so excited. Let us know in chat. I know we have some experienced tabletop role players here. Let us know if you've ever done a session zero and what that was like. We always love hearing stories from people. So as we do this, Ashley, I'm wondering, we can do this either, maybe we can talk about this now or as we go through the player creation, but I thought it might be really fun to discuss sort of the background behind I guess there's sort of a director's guide and a player's guide that you're creating as part of Loreloop. And there are some different decisions that informed, sort of the traits and the archetypes of our characters. They're very different from, again, we try to stress this is an original game system. It's not D&D. So, you won't find, elves or orcs or paladins or warlocks in this game. But you'll find different fun archetypes. So I wonder if you'd like to chat about that.
Yeah, and I would just like to stress that there's always going to be a warlock in everything I create because it's my favorite D&D class, and I just think warlocks are so much fun. So there might be some warlock Easter eggs in Loreloop, but yes, like Kathleen said, Loreloop is not a D&D based game. So when we talk about D&D, we use that as just kind of like a reference for tabletop because it is the game that most people are familiar with right now, especially given its power in popular culture. But our game is very different in genre and in gameplay. But like a tabletop game in Loreloop, you can either when you're playing, you can either be the facilitator of the session, and that's called the director in Loreloop, or you can be a player. And within Loreloop, you are playing as a researcher, which for those who know me will not be surprising at all. I love anything having to do with academia. That was actually, I think, when I think of the development of this game, I feel like playing as a researcher was like my first concept, I think, for Loreloop. I was like, okay, like what are the players going to be doing? And I was like, oh, they can be researchers. And for me, that's me in a nutshell. And I will say that the researchers archetypes that we'll delve into have gone through quite a few iterations because they were a lot more boring than they are now. Now they're a lot more fun and fantastical, but they started off as being kind of like your standard researchers in different scientific fields. And that's always kind of how my process of tabletop development goes. I start with something pretty basic and boring, and then I kind of push it a little bit, each iteration until it becomes a little bit more interesting. So but just like it did not start off as like having these like cool researcher archetype names. They were very much like rooted in kind of reality before the game became a little bit more fantastical. So yeah, when you are playing Loreloop, if you're going to be at the table as a player, you will be embodying a researcher who is from 100 years in the future. And I think that that's a really fun part to the character building. And we'll get through that. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the different elements of character building. But I want just everyone to be thinking about what that looks like for them, because we don't know what 100 years in the future is going to be like. So that is like almost a blank slate. And I think it'll be really cool to see how people interpret that as kind of the prompt of character building. Like what does your character look like? What kind of gear do they have? Like what kind of research do they do? And how is that all informed with the fact that you're from 100 years in the future? And in Loreloop, you're coming back to present day Nevada to do your missions. So there's kind of this mix of like our current understanding of the world, and then trying to push ourselves to think creatively about how someone in 100 years in the future would be making these decisions. So just something to think about as we go through some of this material.
I love that. Sometimes it's hard to think about 100 years in the future. We think that maybe it might be very similar to life today.
Mm-hmm.
But then if I think about 100 years ago in 1924, like way, way, way different. Like no internet or cell phones back then. Maybe like telephone was just getting started, but definitely not like the smartphones that we have today. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
really excited to start thinking through that with you. So I think I'm gonna hop over. Let's start our character creation process. So typically, I guess feel free to just treat this as a regular session zero, Ashley. And again, we put a link in the chat for if people want to follow along with us. We have like a read only version, but you can make a copy of this document to create your own original lore loop character with us. So yeah, let's get started.
Awesome. So for the purposes of our session zero, I will be serving as our director, as that role is called in Loreloop. And so we'll just be working through this material, and as we kind of go through it, I'll give some insight into some of the background of how these gameplay elements kind of came to be. I encourage people to ask questions in the chat if you need some clarification, because we are, play testing this material, and we are, editing it and reviewing it. And so if there's something that really seems confusing, this is a great opportunity to let us know, because we want this to be as just approachable and accessible as possible. But then just kind of general questions, if you want to just kind of muse aloud, I think it would be fun to kind of talk about like, what does a camera 100 years in the future look like for this particular researcher? So we can kind of keep this to an open dialogue. Okay, so like I said, you are a researcher living in Nevada 100 years in the future. You've been recruited on this mission to help find missing pieces of what's called the lore loop. Every team and group that plays this game will have different interpretations of what the lore loop is and what it looks like. In my mind, it's this very like kind of abstract, nebulous concept, not unlike the Twilight Zone. It's like it's something that is a thing that exists, but it's not necessarily this like very physical thing. But for you, it might be something that manifests very specifically. Like maybe it's an actual like portal in a wall through which you can see these different things take place. So just kind of think about what your interpretation of the lore loop is, because it also might help you figure out what your character will be like and what their role is. So you were recruited as part of a research team. And Kathleen, as I did when I was able to play test this with you and the other Nevada Humanities team members, you were with other people, forming a group. So one thing that we talked about as part of the session zero was like, what's your group dynamic? And that's something you and I can talk about as we make some characters today. But something that we would be like typically doing as part of a session zero is discussing that group dynamic. So that is like kind of actually a fundamental part of a session zero, is figuring out like how your group plays together, and setting those kinds of like expectations on one another. And when I say expectations, just more just like establishing mutual respect, that if you have a rival in the group, for example, that's through characters, not through people. Kathleen and I were talking recently just about how D&D group dynamic really can make or break your experience playing a tabletop role-playing game. So your session zero is the opportunity to be thinking through all these things and talking through all these things. I just want to keep that in everyone's mind. So as a researcher, you're giving some research questions to basically study as you embark on some different missions that you will be given. Your research questions include, why are there certain pieces missing in the lore loop? You will be given like an idea of what these pieces are, and part of your mission is to find these missing pieces located throughout these different scenarios. But I just want everyone to think about like, why these ones? Because they do in fact matter. They're very consciously chosen, but I'm curious to know people's interpretation of why. How has Nevada changed in the past century since the lore loop's inception? The kind of like lore of Loreloop is that the reason you're coming back to present day Nevada is because that's when and where the lore loop was initially established. So in order to fix it, you have to come back to its point of origin. So you are kind of reflecting on how much has maybe changed about this place in the past 100 years. And also, I know that there's people in the chat who are not based in Nevada. So our hope is that people will be playing Loreloop in different places, different states, and adapting this to their own state's folklore. So you can think about that question and apply it to your own location. It does not have to be Nevada specific. But that's where at least I am. Kathleen is an interloper these days. She's an honorary Nevadan
Thank
forever.
you.
Of course. And then how can the future of Nevada ensure belonging and prosperity for all? That's really like just a core question of the game. And also the endowment that we've received to develop Loreloop, that's like kind of the core tenet of it, is to, as Kathleen is sharing in the chat, is this initiative is focused on using creative efforts to spark discussions about inclusivity and belonging, and combating hate through art and creativity. So that's something that we want people to be thinking about as they're playing. And then also, what challenges has Nevada faced before now that may affect this future. So like, let's think as researchers and use all this data that we have from forever, basically, and apply that to some of our mission findings and think critically about how that will affect our future. So those are the things that you as a researcher, regardless of your research emphasis, will be tasked with thinking about. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of your prompt when you're creating a researcher. And I put in here that, and I think folks will also appreciate this like they did in the last stream, that I referenced the Prime Directive from Star Trek because I really think that's such a powerful way to view your role as a researcher, which is basically that you shouldn't be returning to present day with the intent of changing the future or kind of like dictating different scenarios. Your role is to study it and to think critically about it and to find opportunities to be a steward without like trying to necessarily like manipulate the past or the future. Oh, someone in the chat said, my mind is surging with different representations of the lore loop that I could make. I'm really excited to hear what people think about the lore loop. Kathleen, I want to ask you, like, when we talked about this concept, what does the lore loop like look like, or what is it kind of, how does it manifest for you?
Great question. It's hard because I'm trying to like really go back to like the original, when we first started talking about this before we created the Mobius. Oh, before
Mm-hmm.
we saw various pieces of artwork that might inspire like the cover art and things like that. I think my thought about the lore loop was like maybe it was like this like shimmering like thing like in the air, not like in the sky because I think like you have to be able to walk through it, but almost like a portal.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there's like maybe just like emerge in like a space one day in Nevada and then people built like a thing around it. So that was actually one idea I had about the lore loop was that it was like this like portal that you could walk through. But a second idea I actually had, so these are like two totally different things, was like a wall of like TVs, just like you could like spot it like
Mm-hmm.
different places in the past. So kind of like one very technological and one very like, oh, what is this portal like thing that you can just like walk
Mm-hmm.
through.
I love that. Those are both like very different interpretations, but have kind of this like core element where you're kind of like viewing different glimpses of things, these different vignettes. And I would say that that's like a recurring motif throughout the game is that there's lots of opportunities to like go into things, go into different pocket realms. Like you're exploring a lot of really peculiar places within the game itself. Like each mission, I feel like has its own kind of weird thing to explore. Some I think people are going to be like, what? This is extra weird. So just be ready for a little bit of weirdness. But I love those interpretations. That's so cool. I'm excited to see if those like if one interpretation or the other like affects your the character you're going to build today. Okay, so let's get into actually designing your researcher. So when you are a researcher in Loreloop, you have what's called an archetype, and this is basically your research like specialty. So, for example, if you are a like a biologist, which we have a fun name for, but like just think of like what's your kind of area of focus area of study. Within that, you get two areas of expertise that, from a gameplay element, will give you a little bit of a boost when you are making decisions. If you've played D&D, you're familiar with the concept of basically saying like, I want to do this thing. Your dungeon master will prompt you to roll a dice, and you use your stats on your character sheet to determine how successful that was, basically. And in Loreloop, we do have an element of dice rolling where if you have an area of expertise and you want to do something that requires that, then I, as your director, will have you roll for that. Our perspective in Loreloop is not that it's like a success or failure. So if you roll a really low number, it's not that you can't proceed with what you want to do. It's a level of confidence that you have in that decision. And I really wanted to keep it related to research. And I think that's kind of how researchers operate, right? Like sometimes you have a lot of confidence in your results because you have the data to back it up. You were able to like craft a study that, accounted for all these different variables. And sometimes you're operating on kind of a gut feeling. So that's the element that I wanted to kind of factor into the dice rolling, because it's really fun to roll dice in a tabletop game, but it had to mean something and it had to be different from how D&D works. So you'll get two areas of expertise as a researcher. if you play 3 or more of the Loreloop missions, you get to pick one more area of expertise. And I think this is kind of fun because it allows you to learn from the other people in your team. And you can pick any of the areas of expertise, which I'll share the list in just a second. But I think that that's a fun way to think about how your researcher will grow over time. You're not ever just stuck having just those 2 areas of expertise, and also how you interpret your own areas of expertise and what those represent to you. There's a lot of fluidity there, which I think is pretty fun. So that's kind of the gist of your character. You get your archetype and you get your 2 areas of expertise. Um, One thing here is that we are encouraging people to think about making characters based off of themselves, but that is certainly not a requirement or an expectation. I think given the nature of this game, I wanted that to be something that we included because if a lot of folks who will play this game are based in Nevada, and we wanted people to think about themselves as citizens and think about the choices that we all make on a daily basis, whether consciously or unconsciously or subconsciously, that affect our communities and help build the lore loop. So that is kind of why we encourage people to do that, but it is not a necessity or requirement to play as yourself or make a fictionalized version of yourself. Today, Kathleen, are you making a character that's inspired by you or something completely different?
I think it'd be fun to do something different. I think when we did our session 0 with the Nevada Humanities team, it was like loosely based on me. So might be fun to try just something a little bit different. But again, keeping in mind what Ashley said, the next time if we do this again, I might go back and do another sort of Kathleen sub 2 or something.
Yeah, for sure. I think either approach is fun and also a learning opportunity. I haven't played as like a fictionalized version of myself. Like I think I've only maybe done that once because I helped write a game called Legend Lore, which is all about basically you as your real self going into a very like D&D inspired fantasy world, and there's a whole like system for adapting your own real self into that. And I found that really fun and interesting to think of like, who would I be in this fantasy world? Like, would I be, I mean, I'd probably be a halfling because I'm not very tall. And I was just thinking about all these different things that I probably would be in this like fantasy world. And what I really liked about that particular book and just the team that worked on it is that they wanted to really maintain a lot of the things that do make us special. And just because you're going into a fantasy world, it doesn't mean that those things are removed from you. Like, for example, if you use a wheelchair, you get to still use your wheelchair when you're in this fantasy world. It just has some cool new elements to it, but you're not like necessarily using fantasy to change those core elements of who you are or how you operate in the world. And I thought that was really cool. So that's also something to think about as you're making your lore loop characters is how does the futuristic element affect those elements of yourself? Like, do you have, if you wear glasses, like, do you have like cool laser goggles instead, or do you have bionic eyes because you've changed those entirely? There's a lot of like nuance and freedom there. So just something to think about. And I also just want to give just a very quick, I guess, spiel about, and this is something that we are including in Loreloop as well, which is about embodying, if you're making characters with identities that you aren't necessarily directly familiar with. And when I say that, cultural identities, if you want to embody a heritage that's not your own, if I just want people to think about like why they feel like they would want to do that. Like, why do they feel like that's important to this character design? How can we do that in a respectful way? If maybe not doing it is the more respectful, thoughtful option. Those are all kind of related to the themes that we're exploring in Loreloop, which is about acceptance and belonging and understanding, the complexities of marginalization in Nevada and beyond. And I think when it comes to character building, those are kind of fundamental questions there. And this is something that I've seen come up in other games that explore, identity in its many different axes. And it's just something that we always want people to be thinking critically about. So it's not to say that you can't make really unique, interesting characters, but if you want to take on a culture that's not yours, like I would just, reflect on why and how you plan to do that. And that's also something that you would want to discuss as part of your session 0. This is a good opportunity for me to talk about safety tools very briefly, because this is something that when I've played session 0s is usually established as part of the session 0. And there's a lot of different tabletop safety tools. And that's basically like a system for like when you're playing games at the table, if you're talking about certain topics or exploring certain topics or themes that sometimes people might not necessarily be I would say like comfortable with in a gameplay setting. There's what's known as like the X, N, and O system that I've used actually on streams before, where you will like hold up different cards to basically indicate like how you're feeling at the table about a certain theme that's happening or something that's happening in the story. For example, I was playing a game where, and I have really bad claustrophobia in real life. So my DM had asked if we wanted to make use of that system. And so they checked in with me throughout the session. And there was an element where my character was going into a really, really tight tunnel. And they asked me if I was okay with that. And I was, because I understood that it was part of the game. But if I had felt uncomfortable about it, I would have held up another card that's basically like, okay, fade to black. We're going to do something different. But I know that that was like kind of a line or a boundary. We are including links to different safety toolkits within Loreloop so that you can find what works best for your table. And I think in this game, it is important to have those conversations because we do delve into themes that sometimes people just don't want to explore in a game. If you want to play a game and have fun and you don't necessarily want to delve into a topic that might feel really real for you, and in some ways that it might be a little bit more of an abstract concept for someone else and not as personal, then you have a way to kind of talk about those with your teammates, basically. Oh, and in the chat, I'm pretty familiar with shades and veils. Yeah, it sounds similar to X, N, and O. So shades and veils is kind of like what is like kind of a non-negotiable for you. Like I never want to explore this topic in a game. I never want to see like violence against children, for example. Like for some people, it's like that's not, there's nothing that is interesting about that for them, you know, or entertaining at all. It's just like, I never really want to like talk about that in a game setting. So that's like a hard line. And then sometimes it's like maybe levels of violence, but there's some levels there that aren't just okay for people to talk, you know, to explore at the table. So those would be things that you would talk about at a session zero. I just wanted to mention that it's relevant to all these things that we're talking about, but I didn't want to go on a whole sidebar about that. So we'll bring it back to this today, but it is relevant to character building. So things to think about when you're making a character, like what are the levels of just reflection that you're doing there? Why do you feel like this is interesting or cool or fun to portray? Is it something that you might not realize maybe crosses some lines for people? I don't know. There's a lot of layers there. I don't have the answers to all that, but it's just something we want people to be thinking about. Anyway, Kathleen, I hope that wasn't too long of a
No, I think all of this is
diatribe.
important to keep in mind because as you mentioned, you know, usually a session zero might include, you know, multiple people to figure out our group dynamics and also what are we comfortable or not comfortable discussing as a group and then respecting each other's boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the more that you feel safe at the table, the more fun you will have. Really, there's quite a lot of pushback to safety toolkits and tabletop. I have to say, like just across the industry and community, I think it's becoming a lot more embraced and accepted. But really, the point is so that everyone can have fun and feel safe and feel included. And there's never it's never a bad thing to talk about these things honestly
Mm-hmm.
and make sure that people feel like they are welcome to this hobby. So let's get into some more of the details about your character. And I'm excited to talk about the researcher archetypes because I think they're pretty fun, and I can't wait to see people's different interpretations of them. So just some general things to think about, some questions that we've provided as a prompt as you're just coming up with the concept are, you know, what would you look like as a researcher in the future? We might actually be changing some of this verbiage to like, how do others perceive you? Something that I've noticed is kind of I hate to say the word trend, but something that I've been seeing more across tabletop design is changing words like, what do you look like? What do you do? You know, to account for different levels, you know, of accessibility and sensory details. So we might be actually changing this to like, how do others perceive you? And I say that because I think it was in our session zero where was it George's character who someone had a scent or something that was really interesting, or maybe it was in another group. Someone that I've done a character building session with had a character that had a very distinct smell that was like related to the fact that they were like a almost like a bionic creature versus like a human, and that like, so they smell, you know, like oils and metals and stuff like that. And so I think the question of like, how do people perceive you, like that's a factor in that, is like what, you know, the other senses that come into play. So how do people perceive you? What do you look like? What do you wear? What would be the same or different about who you are now? And even if you're not playing a character based off of yourself, I still think that's a fun question to think about. What aspects of your personality can you enhance in this fictional version of yourself? And what qualities do you wish you had and want to explore? So, Kathleen, since you mentioned you want to make a character who's very different from the Kathleen we know and love, what is there like a specific trait that comes to mind that you like really want to make a character around?
Well, okay, so I don't know if this is cheating or maybe just like maybe it makes sense, but if I think about 100 years in the future, even though it's not me, assuming that I have children, right? It might be my granddaughter who is living 100 years from now, or a great granddaughter. Let's just say granddaughter because I can't think beyond all the greats. But, like maybe I'll design my character around what I imagine she might look like or be like in the future. I think that'd be a fun way to go about this because in a sense, designing this game, we want the world to be a better place, 100 years from now. Like how can we make the world that we live in now, how can we create that world for the people of the future? So I'll think
Mhm.
about a future granddaughter or son.
That is such a cool concept. I love that. I'm curious if you will use anything that you know of your own kind of past generations in your own family to kind of inform some of that design, or if you're just thinking about like who you are now and maybe what values you would instill in your
Yeah,
long
I'm
legacy.
gonna type this in. So I have so on the left and on the right, I just have like our the information that we're going through on the left, and on my right is sort of our this is a draft character sheet. This is not what the final character sheet will look like in our game. There might be like more boxes and things you can put
Hmm.
in, but just so I don't forget, I think that and I'm gonna just say mixed race. So let's just say like um I don't know, Asian, Caucasian, etc. This is very generic. I think that I have a lot of health issues that run in my family. I feel like when I go to doctors' offices, it's like, check all the boxes, like from your family's health
Hmm.
history. So keeping that in mind, maybe in the future, maybe I think it'd be really cool if not like a suit of armor, but just like having some sort
Mm.
of like protective, like extra protective gear that they would wear. So I'll get back to that. This is sort of like that drafting, and eventually we'll get to the final version. So I'll just say like
Sure.
protective gear for health issues.
Yep. Hmm.
um, I love your question about sort of reframing instead of what do you look like and how do other people perceive you. Um, I love the idea of using other senses. I don't know if I can think about smell right now, but maybe something distinctive about my character is just maybe I have like a very like because of all the gear I'm wearing, like maybe I
Mm.
have like bad feet or like tendons or something, just like very
Hmm.
loud, like is it football? Footsteps?
Footfall.
Yeah,
Hmm.
footfall makes a lot of sound, runs into
Hmm.
things with let's say gear. And this might be fun for role playing because I can imagine like trying to like be quiet or like sneak into a tight space. I'm just like jangling and like
You're right.
clanking the whole time. So
Yeah, I love that. When you mentioned smell, I was doing a play test for a group of teenagers, and they thought that thinking about how other people smell was the funniest thing in the whole world. They were
really,
like, "Well, you smell like," they just thought that was so funny. I was just like tickled by their reaction to that because I think they were thinking like, gross smell, and I was like,
oh
it doesn't, it's literally anything. It's
yeah,
like, does someone have a perfume or a soap, or do they carry a lot of plants on them so they smell earthy. It's not Colin says Axe body spray. Yeah, if Axe is still around 100 years in the future, well, I guess like okay, is Old Spice that's been around for a long time, right? That's still popular these days, but I wonder what's going to be popular 100 years from now. If Axe will be like that cool vintage thing,
yeah,
that everyone's grandpas used to wear. But
yeah,
yeah, the smell question, I think usually everyone's like, huh. But I'm like, there's a lot that we communicate about ourselves through scent. It's not just like bodily sense. It's like there's all these other things about what we do, what we carry that can lead to that. But I love some of these sensory details that you're coming up with.
okay.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah.
Cage says Old Spice started in 1937, so almost 100 years.
Oh
So
my
that was,
goodness.
I guess, that's all, honestly actually older. I wasn't sure if it was like one of those things that they've branded to look old. I know that it is an older thing, but I was thinking like maybe the 60s. But okay, that's so it's using that data, we can maybe think that Axe body spray will be around and popular still in 100 years. I wonder if they'll still have weird commercials or what commercials, I don't know, commercials projecting on our, ceilings. I just imagine this like super commercialized future. Maybe that's a negative. That's my negative kind of view on the future is like just screens everywhere, commercials everywhere, very like Black Mirror-esque world where you just can't escape the Axe body spray commercials.
I love that. Okay, so I'm just gonna say I have a faint odor of I'm just gonna call it ancient spice, and we can, that could be a recurring thing.
I like that. Cool. Those are such neat details. I really like this concept of basically playing as a descendant of yours because I think you can bring a lot of your kind of personal, your current life um and the elements from that into something that, is futuristic and it is curious to think about what the next few generations what kind of world they will live in.
Hmm.
Okay, let's get into some of the research archetypes. Does that sound good,
Yeah,
Kathleen?
perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
So let me scroll down.
Okay. So these are, I think, a really fun part of the Loreloop character building experience. So there are, I should know how many we have by now. I think we have 9 different research archetypes, and I'm including one that's actually where you can basically build your own archetype. So these, like I mentioned earlier, these archetypes began as like very standard researcher archetypes based off of real world, like, academic fields, basically. And they're still linked to those, but they're a little bit more fluid and creative. So you are encouraged to basically take these as a starting point and really build out what you think that means for your character. So the artifactarian is what I always consider like somewhat of an archaeologist, but someone who's just really passionate about relics and artifacts. And what I like about archaeology as just a field of study is this kind of puzzle piece element. Like you're looking at these like literally fragments of civilizations and societies and kind of like putting together the story of these communities. And I think that's a really just fascinating concept. So that's what kind of informed the design of the artifactarian. But that is kind of their primary role is to look through material remains like artifacts, structures, and ecofacts. They're adept at deciphering clues to reconstruct societies, technologies, and lifestyles. They understand and accept the delicate nature of exploring such remains. So you'll notice like when in all of the different archetypes that there is this element of really serving as a steward for your area of study. And again, this goes back to kind of the prime directive from Star Trek is like, as a researcher, like all of these researchers are people who are passionate about kind of protecting their areas. So if you are an archaeologist, kind of by nature in Loreloop, you are someone who has that innate understanding of how to interact with things in a like, I guess, respectful way. You're not necessarily going to be trudging through a ghost town like knocking things over and destroying everything in your wake. So that is kind of one little trait that we're imposing slightly onto people. It's just like thinking of your trade and understanding that like that is innate to all of these areas of study. Like you've accepted that whatever you focus on, that you are approaching that with some level of respect. I think in archaeology, that's kind of a tricky field, right? There's a lot of even though I like to think of it as like this really cool, adventurous field of study, we do have this really very real world, like I would say like issue with, artifacts being removed from different places, being moved around the world. I love to go to museums, but I understand that just like the institution of a museum in itself has some, there's lots of moral questions there about like what should be on display in museums, what should be, kept in its original location, like conquest, like there's just like this expansive history of archaeology as a field of research. So those are just like, it's hard to distill all of that into like one really clean little neat character design. So that's also why this is not just like a specific archaeologist. Like it's just someone who thinks of the different things that they uncover and kind of puts together a story from that. The Bio Ranger is what started off as basically a biologist. But again, is a little bit more open than that. Someone who has just a passion for nature, an understanding of the dynamic of different ecosystems. They love to explore, but again, when they explore, they take a leave no trace kind of mentality there, and they are conservatives at heart. So you'll notice that each of these archetypes has something that they just like that informs their values. So when you are taking on these characters that also will, or these archetypes that will also help with your motivations and building out the backstory of your character. Oh, I see some. Okay, Ranger. So yeah, we're discussing like how these kind of fit into fantasy archetypes as well, because these are supposed to be fantasy, but not in like the D&D fantasy way. So yeah, I would say like, yeah, the Bio Ranger, even though it has Ranger in the name, I would say is like Ranger-esque in the sense that there's someone who can explore a terrain, like they have an understanding of how that terrain works. Like they know if they go into a forest, like what kind of like flora and fauna they may discover there. But I think Druid is probably, yeah, Kathleen said a little bit more like accurate to that. Like someone who can like kind of commune with nature is how I see this. I don't know, Kathleen. I liked your suggestions there. Why do you think this feels a little bit more druid?
I think it's just yeah, I think it's that nature aspect. When I think of ranger, I usually think more of like, maybe the ranged of like maybe like, I don't want to talk about violence here necessarily, but maybe they use
Mm-hmm.
ranged weapons or they're like, further from a distance or in the back.
Sure.
Versus a druid who is just that nature archetype comes to mind first.
Yeah, I like that. So if you are someone who has a D&D kind of background and you're coming to Loreloop with that kind of thought process, like, yeah, that would be, I would say, like a fair build for someone who leans towards rangers or druids or people who are like just really at home in the outdoors.
Park ranger. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Absolutely.
essentially, yeah, that would be actually a really fun basis for a Loreloop character. Is like, yeah, what is a park ranger like 100 years from now? I think that's just like that alone is fascinating to me. So I'm really curious to know like what you all think would be like how that would look. And yeah, Colin, I know Colin very well. We play a lot of D&D together. He is definitely a ranger. He said Ranger typecast. See, I'm Warlock typecast. I'll get into maybe which class I think is the most Warlock-esque in this. We haven't gotten there yet. So Culture Explorer, again, started off as anthropologist. So someone who just like studies culture. Again, like archaeology, anthropology has some of its own ethical dilemmas. Like my goal is not really to lecture here or get into like every single nuance about like all the problematic elements of history and culture, because that's like honestly impossible. But this honestly creating this game and thinking about these things like uncovered that in every element. Like it's like how do you make characters that do not necessarily perpetuate cycles of colonization and violence and things like that, like, but it's ingrained in so much of our modern world. And not to sound like too lofty, but I'm hoping that these are some of the conversations that come out of playing Lore Loop, because it is like this is what does inform our communities. This is what the future will be like if we're not constantly like unpacking these. But just from a game design perspective, I felt like I kept running into like walls in terms of like what felt good to like make like incorporate into the game. And even though like I love the field of anthropology on like a personal level because I just love history and culture, it is, I don't know, it's just there's so many dicey things, and I was just like, how do we make this fun and entertaining while still learning? It's tricky. But I think Culture Explorer I think still is a really cool archetype. So in essence, they are scholars of culture in all of its many forms: music, storytelling, food, fashion, dance, basically all these kind of different forms of art and storytelling. They specifically like focus on how culture is developed and grows and expands and is changed, but they remain objective observers to the best of their ability. And they are, I would say, like they're critical but thoughtful scholars of culture. So their goal is never to like look at a culture and make a judgment call on it. It's just to kind of figure out like this is why this style of music came to be. This is why this form of dance is really integral to this different culture. So those are the different things that a culture explorer would be looking at. Um, I, I like all the discussion in the chat just about druids and um How many of the researchers know how to drive a car in 100 years? I'm thinking Ranger is an explorer too. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about transportation. Because actually, Kathleen, you and the Nevada Humanities team has had some delightful group transport concepts. So we'll talk a little bit more
Okay.
about that. Just we've only talked about three so far. Have you picked your archetype for this character, Kathleen, yet? Or
I haven't yet. Yeah, I think it'll be
okay,
fun to go through the 8/9, and then I'll think about the archetype after that.
okay, cool. So the diplomacier, kind of like what its name sounds like, is like you're essentially a diplomat, but instead of being like a diplomat where you're representing a specific place or group of people, you're just someone who is a natural mediator. You can go into different communities or places and help foster healthy debate. And you just have a knack for being able to hear out different sides of an argument or a dilemma and to help come to a resolution. And I think in Loreloop, this is actually a really fun archetype to play, because there's actually in one module there is a debate that you have to settle before you can actually move forward. So I'm curious to see how people will pick this archetype. But you're someone who's known to be just very like bold and forthright and honest, but can basically broker some level of agreement or peace in any group that you're in. And diplomaciers thrive when given a chance to facilitate a debate or leverage data in decision making. So even though this is slightly different than your kind of standard researcher, where you're a little bit more front facing in terms of like talking with people, you still have to use the data that you're able to gather to inform your decisions. But I like to think of like in the academic world, I feel like this diplomacier would be like person like getting grants, like, lobbying the administration for like, the different things that their other departments need. Like I just see that person just being really in there, like problem solving a lot.
I love Tulip's comment in the chat. They wrote, me saying diplomacier and mentally separating diplomat and seer and imagining someone who is using visions of the future to inform diplomatic decisions.
I love it. Yes, I would say that was 100% intentional when I named this archetype. No,
Perfect.
that's great. Yeah, I love that interpretation though, because when also coming up with all the names for these, I wanted them to be fun and kind of weird, kind of fit within the style of Loreloop, which is very much this like weird cross-genre game. And I thought Diplomacier is kind of like a fun, weird title that evokes thoughts of being like a diplomat, but also, yeah, someone who is using all of this information to make decisions about the future. So speaking of problem solving, that is also the logistician's expertise. And the logistician was heavily inspired by engineers. My husband's an engineer, so I see an engineering brain in motion like every single day. And it's really cool, I think, to see how engineers look at the world. And of course, all engineers are very different, but they're just known for their problem solving because they can really like survey something and kind of break it down into the smaller pieces and find the areas that could be improved or fixed or repaired. They have a deep understanding of materials and tolerances. And so that's really what has informed the design of the logistician. So they're not based on any specific type of engineering. They're just someone who is really adept at problem solving. They're eager to problem solve. They do so with, I would say, like if the diplomacy is using more like qualitative data, where people talking and discussing, and they're kind of using that to inform their decisions. The logisticians looking at more like the quantitative data. So they love numbers and math and science, and they can look at like a building and see some of its like weaker points, which is very helpful when you're navigating some of the adventures within Loreloop. So that's what kind of informs the design of the logistician. So they are very much like an engineer in inspiration, but mostly in just like how engineers feel very passionate about, making things stronger and better and understanding scaffolding on both like a literal sense, but also just a figurative sense. Like where are the areas that need more support? And that's definitely what a logistician does. The metagen is kind of your group healer. So for those talking in D&D archetypes, this is very much like your alchemist, or yeah, your resident healer, someone who's like an on-site doctor, someone who's really passionate about healing in its many forms. Kind of that mix between understanding like just field medicine, but also the immense field of medicine as well. So if anyone has kind of a passion for either of those things, I think this is a really fun archetype to play. Kathleen, when we had done our session 0, your character that you had made then was a metagen, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And what appealed to you about this archetype for that character?
That's a good question. I think I was thinking then about sort of, myself like now and just thinking about,
Mm,
like bad eyesight. I have like back pain all the time and just thinking, so my parents are still with me, but I think the backstory of my character that I created for that time was that her parents had passed away, and she didn't want anyone to ever feel that pain that she experienced
mm,
with that loss. And so, wanting to learn more about like the sensation of pain, she became a doctor or a cleric or a metagen, and that led to some very fun, unintentional character interactions with the other character at our table who was a robot, because then it meant that my character would be like, well, do not to sound horrible, but do robots experience pain? And like how to go
yeah.
about testing that. So that was sort of the backstory of my character, just thinking about it just kind of came to me about,
Mhm.
negating pain at that point.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that it was more about like physical pain. It was just like, emotional pain.
Hmm.
And I think that's a really interesting original take on a medic is like you're not yeah what's your role on your team. It's not just to like patch up wounds. It's also like I don't know, to be this a support person.
Yeah.
And I feel like and in tabletop in fantasy as well, like the healer is always seen as like a support person, which is also interesting to me that we view it as such. Like I feel like in D&D, like people who play the cleric are always I think relegated to being support. Like they aren't always like they don't always get to be like the star of the show because they are there to like help other people feel better. But I also think it's such a vital role to play on a team, especially when you're going out on missions and doing field work, to have someone who's knowledgeable about healing and wound treatment. So I think it's a really interesting archetype for people who just are interested in medicine. So I think quite a few people have gravitated toward that one. So I don't know if that's just emblematic of people who like role playing games, just like are interested in that kind of character build. But it's been fun to see the different types of metagens. And then we have the spatial scout. So actually, we were talking about rangers in D&D, and I've always kind of thought of rangers in D&D as kind of like navigators, and
Hmm.
that's what I would say the spatial scout is. They're someone who can look at a map and they know exactly how to interpret that map. And I think that's an interesting concept, especially 100 years in the future. Like, what are maps like then? How do we use maps? Our relationship with maps now is very different, even than it was like 20 years ago, I would say. So this is someone who can just, they can kind of understand the lay of the land wherever they are. They use a mix of like technology to do so, but also can look at the cosmos and find their way. They always know the direction of the North Star. And they, like logisticians, like they can, look at a building and kind of deduce the best way to traverse a building based off of its layout. And they just like can always kind of find their way wherever they are. And they just have a knack for doing that. And then lastly, well, the last of the official archetypes is the word weaver. And then we'll talk a little bit about kind of the one where you can make your own. But the word weaver originally began as the linguist. And as a writer, I got to say, I'm always partial to the word weaver because they're just someone who is passionate about language and communication and storytelling in all of its many forms. It encompasses a lot. So this person, like almost like the spatial scout who can look at a map, the word weaver can look at some sort of like language, even if it's not one that they are familiar with, and understand some of the logic there. And I feel like I've met people like this in my life who just learn new languages just with like some ease. And I think some people just have just this knack for looking at different languages and listening to languages. And even if they don't know it, they can kind of figure out some meaning from that. And that's kind of how I see the word weaver. It's not that they're like fluent in every single language or, whether that's oral or written or verbal. But it's just that they can like understand how the human brain or just creatures' brains have informed language and communication. And I think I'm excited about this one because I think this is fun from a storytelling perspective. And also, I don't know, I know some people in the chat will know what I'm talking about, but there's one of my favorite movies is Arrival with Amy Adams. And when I was thinking about this archetype, I was thinking about her character in that movie. She's a linguist, and it's about these aliens who come to Earth, and they communicate in this really beautiful, actually very Loreloop-esque
You're right.
language. That's supposed to be a recurring theme in my brain or something. But they basically communicate in this language, and she, as a linguist, is able to decipher this in a way that no one else can, and it unlocks basically all of space time to her. But it's this really like it's a beautiful like I don't want to say quiet movie because it's like epic in a lot of ways, but it's just a really, I don't know, it's one of my all-time favorite movies. I think about it all the time. And the Word Weaver, though, reminds me a lot of her character in that movie, just how she looks at language. Like she uses her background as a linguist to interpret this language that has no like linked to the human world. So she has to use just really creative thinking to do that. So that's my own, just that's some creator diary like insight into the Word Weaver when I was thinking about that. But that's just an incredible movie. And I'm curious if anyone will use the circles in that as their own lore loop visuals, because that's actually that maybe that'll be mine because I think that that's a cool view in the lore loop. So those are the established archetypes that we are providing, but quite a few folks in playtesting had expressed a desire to make their own, because within that, like, you know, maybe you want to be a spatial scout and a bio ranger because there's a lot of overlap there for you, or maybe you want to combine two completely different things. You want to be a word weaver and a metagen, which actually is probably what I would do. And so you can do what we call a dual degree wielder, which I continuously spell incorrectly. I spell dual like dueling, like, but it's supposed to be dual like two, which I think is just a funny typo because that's just, it could be either, but basically you're a dual degree wielder where you can pick your own, kind of make your own archetype. It can be called whatever you want, or you can use a mashup of the names that are already there, and you get to pick two areas of expertise that fit into that. And basically the concept of that is completely up to you. And I'm really curious to see what kind of combinations people come up with for that. Because during playtesting, one of the questions that we have on our playtesting questionnaire is like, if you think we need more archetypes, like there's lots of areas of research that we didn't necessarily cover, but most people said that they didn't really feel like that was necessary. But I think this kind of fits that for people. Like if there's not one there that they like, then they can just make their own. So that's the overview of the archetypes. I didn't really get too much into the areas of expertise. The areas of expertise themselves are fairly straightforward. And actually, I think in the director's guide is where those are broken down. I can talk through those a little bit. But Kathleen, based off of these archetypes, what are you thinking for your character? I'm really curious.
Yeah, this is a great question, right? Because I think, every group or every individual is going to create a little bit differently. Like, I think sometimes there are people who have, like, one specific class or type of person they like to make. Maybe they have, like, some variation on a name, and so they'll just go, like, top to bottom. I love how you ask about like the motivations for your researcher. I think this is the last question on this character sheet on the right. So like just sort of working backwards from that. Like I want to think about the story of my person, what motivates her before deciding what her archetype
Mm.
is. So as I mentioned, I was a metagen in the last game, but I'm just thinking about what I've already sort of said about this new character who, let's just say, like potential, granddaughter or grandson in the future, grandchild. I'm thinking about the fact that they're wearing some sort of like, like power suit, like a futuristic,
Mm.
like Samus. I think that's sort of like my, like, for people that know Samus and that Metroid reference, that's who I'm envisioning as my grandchild. So because they make, a lot of sound and they're very clumsy and they run into things, but they've had health issues all their life, maybe, maybe they spent a good chunk of their childhood, like in their room, they weren't allowed to really go outside,
Mm.
that kind of a thing. So because of that, I think now that they have this awesome power suit, they want to take advantage of the fact that they can, explore the world to their heart's content. So I'm going to go back up. I think it might be fun. I'm thinking either Bio Ranger or Spatial Scout. I think
Mm.
it'd be really funny to have a Spatial Scout who's very clumsy and loud, but does their best to get around. So that's what I'm thinking of. I think it just comes out of my characters sort of when they were younger, they were not allowed because of health reasons to go out, and now that they're
Mm.
older, they can, travel the world to their heart's content, and that's sort of sparked their interest in the lore loop.
Yeah, that's so cool. I like how much you're using your motivations to pick the actual archetype. Like you said, a lot of people kind of work the other way. And I think either option, like I think when people don't know what kind of character to make, sometimes you do just kind of want to like roll a dice and pick an
Mm-hmm.
archetype and start from there. And actually, we're including some ready-made characters in Lore Loop so that people can just play with something that's already established. But it when it comes to tabletop role-playing games, those motivations really are everything. It's what makes a game fun. It's what makes it like interesting to you. It's what gives your character like a purpose. And for those who might not be super familiar with playing a tabletop role-playing game, like if you've never played before, how it like just a really quick example is like as your director, I would be prompting all of you like, you approach this castle, you don't see any lights on within it. Here's what you can discern about it. Then you would tell me kind of like what you want to do, how you want to approach that. And even though that's like just it seems like a relatively like minor decision, like, how you approach the castle makes a big difference. Like if the floor is unstable inside and you just like walk right in, then you'll fall right through the floor. Or you might want to take a little bit more of a careful approach. Like all those little kind of things are based off of what your character would do. So Kathleen, like knowing those elements of your character, like I love the idea of your spatial scout, like knowing that there's probably some like unstable flooring, but also maybe just being like, well, I'm just going to power through anyway because I'm equipped with my suit. So I see those really resulting in some really fun and impactful like moments in the game just based off of the characterization you've shared so far.
Yeah, I'm excited. Now I'm
Yay.
heartbroken because I
Okay.
have two characters I'm starting to love.
I know that happens pretty quickly into the character building process for any game. Is that once you start to put together your character, it's like they start to become so real. And I've talked about this a lot with my group that I've played with for a long time, and of which Colin is in the chat. He's one of my longtime friends. But just like even though we play these games as people and their characters that we're playing, the experiences still feel real. Like we played one campaign especially that we talk about all the time. This was years ago that we played it, but it just like it left such an impact on us. Like it was just such a fun and immersive and like emotional experience that I don't know, you do put parts of yourself into the things that you do at, in a tabletop game. And I think that's kind of why it's such a powerful storytelling medium. And that's what kind of continues to bring me back to it as someone who just loves stories. It's just there's nothing else really like that. So it's not I'm excited to hear that you're falling in love with both of your characters, Kathleen, but it does make it tricky to figure out who you're going to play when we next play Lore Loop. So let's keep building out your character and we'll see how you feel. Um, do you have are you do you have a name for your character yet? Have you thought of anything like that?
I don't yet. I think, in the future, I think it would be really interesting to build, I'm gonna say like a non-binary, or just for now. I think that I
Mm-hmm.
tend to, when I play games, I often pick like the female version of a character, like if you have an option. But I like how in recent years you've had the option in certain games to pick, not an option that isn't, M or F. You can pick something else. Or
Mm-hmm.
even in the game I was a teenage ex-colonist, I think you can like pick along like a spectrum, which is really,
Mm.
really great. So I know I've been talking about thinking my future granddaughter or grandson. I'll just say like grandchild. So I don't know. I'm trying to think of a name. I don't have a good name yet. If anyone has suggestions, feel free to share them in chat. Um, let's see. Yeah, maybe this will come to me.
Okay. Yeah, we'll keep building them out. And we'll see how that goes. Oh, and then I also want to say my longtime DM John is in the chat as well. So hi, John. So we make up like one half, I think, of our group with me and Colin and John here. So we'll have to recruit the rest of our group for the next stream. But yeah, I don't know, we just have bonded so much over D&D. So I just love tabletop for how much it just brings people together. And also I think like a session zero is a great way to start fostering that. Like if you want that from your group, if you want to have this long-term game that you're all so like deeply immersed in, like this is a great chance to talk about that and really like establish that for the long term. Okay. So let's see what we need to do next. So after you've picked your archetype within the player's guide, you're prompted to well, you get your two areas of expertise that come with your archetype. I could talk a little bit about those because those are also something that might change like someone's mind when they're making their characters. And these are fairly straightforward. So within tabletop games, when you make your characters, you're given like character stats basically, and every game does this completely differently. D&D, you get like a character sheet, you get a bunch of numbers for different traits that you have. It's fairly math intensive, which is interesting to me because I think D&D is most people's like first foray into tabletop, and it was for me as well. But when you play lots of different tabletop games, there's some character building that's way more straightforward that you don't have to do any math. You just are given very like kind of basic things that help you make decisions for your character. I've tried to kind of straddle the line there because I think some people who like playing tabletop, they want their character sheet. They want to know, the nitty gritty of stuff. That's where kind of the areas of expertise come into play. Like when you roll your dice, if you make a decision, if the check that the DM or that the director has been provided includes your area of expertise, like for example, going back to the castle example, if you approach the door or you open this door and you see this flooring, like I would prompt you to make a materials check. And that's basically you would use your knowledge to see how stable the flooring is, or maybe a field identification check. If you have an archetype that does not have that as an area of expertise, then you would roll 1d20. And then you would share your result with me. And then if you do have the area of expertise, you would roll 2. So when you have an area of expertise, it does give you a little bit more of a boost to roll a higher number. It doesn't mean you will. Just because you have 2d20 doesn't mean that you're going to roll a higher number, but you have the likelihood of rolling a bit higher. And again, just to reiterate, that's not a success or fail. Like for example, if you rolled a low materials check, and the floor is unstable, I wouldn't necessarily say like you fall through the floor immediately. What I would say is that you just can't really tell. You're navigating with a lack of confidence here. But if you rolled really high, I would be like, yeah, you could see the cracks in this one area. It looks a little bit more worn. So you think that if you go around this other way, you might, you won't risk, falling through the floor. Or like if you rolled really high and you're like a logistician, I'd be like, okay, like if you rolled like your max amount of points, I'd be like, okay, you can see exactly like where people would be able to step. Like if your group steps in its entirety on this platform, this is where they would be safe. If you have 3 people in this one area, they could fall through the floor. Like it's basically the level of confidence through like with which you would proceed. So that's where the areas of expertise kind of come into play. You can still roll for any kind of decision that you want to make, and that's always up to the director's discretion, but you do not have to have an area of expertise in something to roll for it. So if the word weaver wants to check the floor, I would still have them make a materials check, but that might not, because that's not their area of expertise, they would just be navigating with a little bit less confidence. So that's why those are part of your character building. But it's not so much to limit what people are able to do. But I did want to just very briefly talk about the areas of expertise, just to kind of give an overview while we're working through this. And actually, more of this information is in the director's guide. So I'm realizing that more of this should be in the player's guide as well. You have the list, but not the descriptions, which the director sees on my view. But your areas of expertise include art, communication, field identification, healing, history, materials, navigation, and tools. Those we're also going to have like weird words. I was going to make those all like, and I just felt like it was too many layers of weird stuff. And I think the areas of expertise, I just kind of wanted to be a little bit more straightforward so that when you're playing the game and you want to do something, it's easy for everyone involved to just figure out what you need to roll to determine how confident you are about your decision. So given that, these are probably pretty straightforward, but if you haven't, I'm just going to say AOE, area of expertise, not Age of Empires, which other people might know as their acronym, which is definitely my acronym for AOE. I love Age of Empires. So art is basically your knowledge of artistic practices. Again, it's like all the research that you've done on art has informed some of your ability to like interpret art, like really look at it with some background on like the composition of art. Okay. Yeah. AOE too. The best. Love those games. As soon as I say a name of a game like that, I'm like, I just get this urge to like immediate desire to play it. There's like a few games that do that for me. And one is always like AOE. Like as soon as I think of that, I'm like, I wish I could just boot up my computer and play that like right this second. Communication is like, again, just knowledge of basic forms of communication, including but not limited to letters, telegrams, and radio correspondence. Again, it's like these are always kind of open to interpretation. It's these matter more almost for the director, because as you're playing Loreloop, when you're facilitating the game as a director, you would be given prompts within the text to like have your characters or your players roll for these different things. And you don't have to roll for everything that you want to do. This is guidance that the director has. But if you are in an old building and you hear the sound of an old radio, like if you're someone who has communication as one of your AOEs, then you can, kind of how the radio works. You like understand that it's from a radio, like you can kind of deduce some basic information about it. It's not so much that you like can speak every language or communicate with everything on the planet. It's just that you have this foundational knowledge. Field identification is your ability to accurately identify flora and fauna in a variety of natural biomes. I'm going to expand this a little bit because as I've been writing, I've been using field identification a lot as a check within Loreloop, because I just realized that for me, it was functioning as kind of like in D&D, it would be like your perception check. Like, it's like, basically, what are you observing about something and how keen is that observation? And based off of how keen the observation is, there's some more information you will discern from there. So that might actually be adjusting slightly, but as it is now, that's what that particular AOE does. Healing, again, is your ability to treat and diagnose a variety of basic ailments and maladies. I believe more than one archetype has the healing AOE, because I wanted to not have any, maybe it is just the metagen. I tried to make all of the AOEs like be diversified amongst the different archetypes. I actually had a lot more areas of expertise, and I just realized that there was so much crossover between things, and I'd rather people just use their creativity and keep the list simple. But there's something that I still might be adjusting a little bit before the final book comes out. That's because we're in playtesting. That's kind of the stage that these things get adjusted. Because I'm like, I want kind of one more archetype to have access to healing as their AOE. I just think I feel like the Spatial Scout would maybe have that. I don't know. I need to figure out exactly where that would fit. And then history is like your ability to consult a variety of sources, piecing together context. I also have included in the director's guide, like basically researchers with this AOE like can do this with their AOE, like just to kind of put a little bit more context, into like what each AOE does. So like, for example, for history, like researchers with this area of expertise have excellent memory and adeptness at seeking out sources and context. So that's like, it kind of like distills it to its like most important element of that being that person's area of expertise. Materials are the ability to investigate and test objects to determine their material composition. Researchers with this area of expertise understand basic tolerances and can discern how two or more materials may react when used together. Navigation, ability to read, interpret, and navigate a place using an analog or digital map or tool. And then tools, again, it's kind of self-explanatory, but the ability to wield a variety of tools and have that kind of foundational knowledge that if you have a basic toolkit, you know what each one does, and you can use them to some level of success. And that's just like a very quick overview of what the AOEs are. Truthfully, there probably could be more. There also could be less. I've toyed with both. I still think some things are going to be moved around slightly, but our goal is to keep Loreloop approachable to play. I think when people sometimes do see a long character sheet, like for D&D, for some people that excites them. I get excited sometimes about filling in all those things. And for some people who are new to tabletop, that's a lot. So we're trying to find this like balance there between enough character information and not. Kathleen, are there areas of expertise that you find interesting? Are there any that you would change about your character archetype that you've picked since you picked Spatial Scout? Do you feel like the ones that you're given with Spatial Scout suit your character as you're envisioning them?
I think it does, right? So I think, right, sort of the backstory from my character is that they wear this like power suit of sorts because they grew up sort of like maybe like a very like sickly child, had a whole range of health issues, and now they're ready to just like get out and explore the world. So I think navigation makes sense. Let me go back to Spatial Scout. With communication, I think, that's something that I think works, or it could also change, right? It's hard because really, like you said, field identification can be applied to so many different art. Like really, everyone could have multiple areas of expertise. So I would say like if not communication, maybe like field identification or history. I like the idea
Mm-hmm.
of maybe, they like to learn like the history of a place to learn a little bit more about it because again, when they were
Mm,
younger, they didn't get the chance to maybe go out to like national parks or elsewhere. It was just places that they had only read about in books, and that's where they could
hmm.
imagine where they could someday travel and explore. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there's so many that fit into different archetypes. Like I do kind of want to do some slight like reorganizing, redelegation of stats. But also it really comes down to whatever concept the person wants to play.
Yeah.
Because also no one has to use the archetypes as they're established. Like these are everything in this game is although I do feel like we provide a lot of material, a lot of it's a starting point. Like a lot of it's just to kind of kick off your own creativity. Like I'm hoping that people will write, 10-page backstories for their characters like some people do for D&D and just get really excited about what that concept is to them, and this is just like a little part of that. Like their archetype like will help spark some of that, but really the creative stuff comes down to the individual player, which is the hope. Okay, so we've talked about archetypes and talked about the areas of expertise. Let's talk a little bit about your research gear
Okay.
for your
Let's do that.
character, because you've already talked a little bit about some of their gear, which is like this cool, like almost like armor system that they have. So I feel like some of these other elements of their gear might kind of fit into that. Um, and just as another designer note, just to kind of give some insight into how this kind of continues to evolve. Man, okay. So the gear for this game, I spent so much time thinking about the gear for this game. And it doesn't look like it because there's just now this like one bullet point list. But I tell you that I've like lost sleep over this part of this game because initially I had this big table of like gear and all these different things, and just through playtesting it just came up that was like not necessary. One, because almost everyone who was creating a character was like incorporating gear into their concept like from like the get-go without really any prompting. And that was really exciting to see as a designer because it meant that I didn't have to do as much there for them to feel creative enough to do that. And like Kathleen, I'm thinking of this character that you've created now and how much like their gear is like part of the story. And we saw that when we were playtesting with your colleagues as well. Like they were coming up with all the items and things that they had without really any prompting. And so I realized that this like complicated system of like you need these very specific things was kind of unnecessary. So this has been streamlined a lot. What we've kind of decided on is that there's some core things that everyone really should have as part of their research kit. We'll talk about the AI thing in just a second, but I want to talk about some of the other gear elements first. So one is that everyone gets a research kit that has kind of the essential items that you need. You get like a water canteen, you get rations and food, you get some rope. And again, that's kind of very D&D-esque where every character gets like basic equipment. And so I feel like just as researchers, you would have some of those like core items. I might expand that slightly. Then I changed this next part. I think so. You still have the random table and stuff, which we can definitely use. So this is what this was before, and then I had even expanded it further, and then I scrapped it. But it's still kind of a good thing we can use for the sake of our discussion today. But what I ended up changing it to is like instead of everyone having like this very specific detailed list that fit with their archetype, is that I made it more general. So I want people to think about what does your character use to write with? It can be analog or digital, whatever you use to write with. You just need a tool to write with or scribe with. You need something to view long distances with. Because again, I think I have one. Yeah, I think I had a telescope like for the artifacturian. Like I was having very specific things that were on everyone's list, but when we were playtesting, people were coming up with their own versions of like that. Like they're like, oh well, I have goggles that I can see far away. I think that was your character, right? You have cool
Yeah, I
goggles.
did.
Yeah, yeah. And then that actually that's come up multiple times in playtesting where people will have like just from again totally unprompted, they would be like, well, I have goggles that allow me to see far distances. So I'm like, okay, well then you don't need a
Telescope.
telescope unless you want a telescope. Like it's just like you don't need a big thing if you have something else that's more futuristic and fits better. But regardless, your character needs something that they can view long distances with as part of your research kit, something with which to record audio or video or media. So again, I was putting like cameras and like trying to think of like what the camera would be and trying to describe it. And I was like, I'm just gonna let people figure that out for themselves because it's more interesting that way. So you just need some sort of device that does that. And then something to this one I might rethink a little bit, but I wanted something to fabricate on the go, like a 3D printer or something like that. And again, maybe this is just my own vision of 100 years from now, but I just feel like that sort of like thing where people would be able to have easy access to fabricating things through like 3D printers or, like, I don't know, laser cutters that are more widely available. Like I just envision that being like in our society a little bit more in 100 years, but that's just kind of based off my own personal experience being part of maker communities where that's become more common. So, and I just thought that might be cool for a researcher to have, but I don't have a specific vision for what that should be like. So it's just more of a suggested item. But that's like basically the new list. And people get to pick from 2 like trinkets from a random trinket table. Even that though, I might even scrap some of that because people have been coming up with their own trinkets. Okay, so I say that before I figure out what items you have, Kathleen. I say all this because part of playtesting is figuring out like what information people need and also what they don't need. And so much of this, my initial plans were kind of with this assumption that people would be making human characters. And to my utter surprise, almost every single playtest I've run, people have made characters who are not human. They've made like robotic characters, bionic characters. People have wanted to make aliens. I'm like, you're welcome to make aliens. I don't know. There's some level there that I'm not sure if it totally fits with the spirit of Loreloop, but to me, the robotics element feels a little bit more like it makes sense, a little bit more sense to me in terms of like the themes of the game. But I say that because a character who has robotic, I guess, like traits and abilities, they don't necessarily need the same gear that like a human character would need. So as a designer, I was imposing a lot of my own like thoughts onto players. And so that's just like, I just want to kind of give that insight. Like it's easy when you're coming up with character creation stuff to kind of like, I was like inadvertently dictating how I thought people should be making their characters just by the information that I was providing. So it's been actually it's really cool to see through playtesting what things people don't need and how you can encourage creativity sometimes by removing information. So I removed that table because it was just really limiting. And you don't really need all those things if you're from 100 years in the future and you're a sentient computer, basically. So that was just it was cool to see that. It's always really like humbling as a creator to see like how people break your game in a good way. Like you want people to be breaking your game in playtesting so that you can make it the best it can be. But that was, the very first playtest. Like I feel like immediately like the gear part of character building was like made obsolete.
Right.
So you can spend a lot of time writing things that just never see the light of day.
Or even my coworker who created Carl the bee. She created a character that was literally a bee. So of course, then a lot of things change because of that. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that I could never have expected in a million years. I will say, like, again, like I said earlier in this stream, when I start my first iteration of something is always fairly boring. Sometimes I get really stuck in my ways as a writer. This is why you always iterate when you're a writer. You never use your first draft of something, but it's, you got to get the ideas out somehow. But for me, I'm always like, even when I write fantasy and sci-fi, I'm always like a little safe about it. And my early concepts were pretty safe and rooted in like kind of just regular stuff. Because again, like academia, I love academia and like school and research and stuff. So everything was really rooted in this like very like traditional thing. And so it never occurred to me that someone would make a bee as a character because I, in some ways, am not that creative with it. I was thinking of people making very like kind of standard humanistic characters. And that's actually been a fault of mine in writing for D&D and something that multiple D&D editors have kind of taken me to task for is like I make a lot of human characters. I make kind of a lot of the same kind of archetypes that have a lot of the same traits. And I really try to like push myself to think a little bit more beyond that. Which is something that has helped when you work on really creative, vibrant teams, like a lot of that's pushed. You're pushed anyway because you have to think about people who aren't you. But that's just like that's always been kind of my my I would say like something that I have to just be really aware of is that I tend to, when I'm making characters, I make a lot of the same kinds of characters. And the way I like to make characters is not how everyone wants to do it. So when I'm writing a game for an audience or for people who are going to play it, who aren't just me, I have to consider all the different ways that people are going to want to explore that. So removing a lot of the gear suggestions actually really encourages more creativity and gives people and empowers people to think about the things that work better for them. That said, I was like, should I be writing a guide about making like animal based characters in Loreloop? And I was like, I don't know if that's within the scope of the book, but I loved that we had a bee. And actually, I was pleasantly surprised, Kathleen, that didn't break the game. Like when we actually played, when we did our session, it actually still worked. It wasn't at odds with the stories and how they were written. So that was a relief because that's really hard when you've written a lot of material and you do your first play test and actually run the game and something is just like fundamentally broken.
Mhm.
And it's pretty disheartening to have that happen. But luckily, Carl the bee still was very much able to um, be an active participant in the mission. So that was pretty fun. Okay, so that's the gear kind of in a nutshell. Are there specific? I didn't talk about the AI stuff, but I'll let you share some of your gear that you have before I talk about
Yeah, so
the
maybe we can start
elements of
from
it.
here. And again, as Ashley mentioned, we're all still very much in the playtesting phase, right? So like this document that I have on the left, in which we shared a link to in the chat, like this is, I think, already out of date. So we'll be updating this in the future, look very different in the final version of the
Mm-hmm.
book. But we love just getting people's feedback. So this is why, we're also doing this stream today. So if anyone has any thoughts on like things we should include or edit, we'd love to hear those. So yeah, as I think about equipment, and I'm just gonna put power suit, right? Because that
Mm-hmm.
I don't want that to be like game breaking, but I feel like a power suit in the future, maybe like a very basic one. Like they're already building like these exist in like 2024. Like people have those like exoskeletons. Like if you're paralyzed,
Mm-hmm.
you can walk with these. So in a sense, like there's like a prototype of a power suit already in effect for someone like me in the future, my descendant who might have these issues with their legs when they're a child and cannot walk, and now they have that ability. So I feel like in a power suit, I'll just say, I don't know, like would I have a helmet? I don't know. Maybe it's a power suit
Mm-hmm.
without a helmet. I feel like sometimes when you think of a power suit, or you think of like a helmet that has like I don't know, like Iron Man. Like that's what I think of like with power suit in addition to Samus from Metroid. But I kind of want
Mm-hmm.
to get away from that just to like push myself a little bit. So maybe there is no helmet, but instead it's so tempting to like write glasses into everything I do. I feel this as someone who is like poor eyesight, and I just want to see more characters with like glasses, like in
Mm-hmm.
various forms of media, especially video games, so I can cosplay more characters with glasses. Maybe instead of glasses, maybe she got surgery, so she just has
Mm-hmm.
like enhanced sight. But maybe it's like easily irritable, so maybe she would have some sort of eye protection, maybe like a visor, like some sort of like hat with like a screen, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll just say like I'll just say special sun hat with screen to protect eyes.
I love that. I'm envisioning like a farmer's market hat, the kind of like big straw
I
hat
know.
you'd wear. Like that's so sweet. I love it.
Yeah, but it's the future, right? Maybe this is
Yeah.
totally normal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then what other item would she carry? And again, I'm just gonna, as a disclaimer, like I did not think about my character before stream, right? So all of this is like
Mm-hmm.
completely
Yeah.
unprompted. So I'm trying to like be creative on the spot, which can sometimes be difficult. But I don't know. I would love for her to carry around some sort of like memento or keepsake, whether it's
Mm.
like a family heirloom, like, an engagement ring, actually,
Mm-hmm.
or like a necklace, or I don't know, even like a tattoo, like just something to sort of
Ooh.
like
Mm-hmm.
reinforce that like family connection. So maybe I'll just say, I'm trying to think. Maybe I'll just say like family heirloom. Trying to think what is something that you can inherit that wouldn't get in the way of like a power suit. Like I don't want like a ring because I feel like if I had a
Mm-hmm.
glove, it might get as much as I love the idea of having like an heirloom ring, like that's not very practical for maybe like day-to-day
Mm-hmm.
researcher life when you're going into the future or back into the past as someone from the
Mm-hmm.
future. So I'm gonna think about
Hmm.
this. A necklace, like a very unobtrusive necklace,
Sure. If it's
maybe.
something that like stays kind of like tucked within
Yeah.
your
So I'll just
your
say
suit.
like a simple necklace.
Hmm.
Um, just I'll just say like of personal meaning. It like no special powers or anything. She just really likes this necklace, and that just gives her a little bit of like maybe when she's nervous, she like I have a necklace. Like maybe she just like takes it out and like rubs it or something.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great little character quirk. And especially if you're so like you're if you were talking about, talking about this at a session zero and you told us that at the table, it would be fun to talk about if so that your fellow players would know that, but would their characters detect that? Because they would if that's like your tell,
Hmm.
like then is that something that they perceive about you when they're communicating with you? Like can they tell that you're feeling weird about a situation based off of how much you're like, kind of using your necklace as like a grounding, tool. So I think it's such a fun little character
Yeah,
detail.
and I love this comment from chat that says, yeah, the story opportunities. What if your researcher runs into a past family member that, like, like me from 2024 that
Yeah.
recognizes the heirloom? So yeah, a
Hmm.
lot of opportunities there. So like, I feel like you just never know from your session zero what little detail might like pop up again in the future. So maybe
Yes.
those are my items for now, like in
Okay.
addition to let's say like my like normal researchy kit as a spatial scout.
Yeah, that's great. And then there's one more piece of gear that everyone gets actually as at the start of your kind of first mission, as you're kind of going over your mission directive, which maybe that's how we'll end today. We can do
Hmm.
the kind of mission directive, which would kick off your
Yeah.
actual lore loop campaign. Um, but you get what's called a Lorelei device, and Lorelei is your Loreloop AI. And I called it that because when I came up with the name Loreloop, I think it was Christina, your executive director, had said that when Loreloop is all capitalized, it looks like the word Lorelei, and that made me think of like I wanted to actually already incorporate some sort of AI thing element into this because again, it's futuristic and also it's very topical right now with all the AI stuff, and it's just like something I wanted to find a way to include, and so. I was like, well, then that's the name of the AI. It's a Loreloop AI. It's a Lorelei. So I gotta credit Christina directly for that one. But you get what's called your Lorelei device. And actually, let me find. Do I have my good thing to talk about? Kind of how that works. I think it's in the mission directive. So everyone on your team receives a Lorelei device, and what this device like basically like looks like and functions like is up to you. It does have some kind of core elements that it needs to do though. So it is an AI device, which means that it's basically there to aid in your research. It's something that you can use as part of your research missions to, seek out information, to use for navigational purposes. So it does have to have so the design requirements are that it must be small enough for easy transport. Although I might change that because I'm like, if someone wants to have some big thing, computer, something that they take with them on their missions, that could be funny, or they could figure that out. But it must allow for visual, auditory, or tactile sensory response. So the example I give, like if you have a screenless and speakerless device, it could still use vibration to indicate like the direction or the correct response to a question. So if you ask it like a simple yes or no question, it's able to kind of communicate something with you. But the actual design of it is ultimately up to the individual player. So it can be like a device worn on the wrist, like a smartwatch. It could be like a smartphone. Um, it could be a pair of glasses. And I'm mentioning this because this was very funny during our playtest, but one of the examples that I give is that it could be a small robotic fly that perches itself on your shoulder. And we thought that was very funny with our player who was a bee, as she had a little tiny fly on her little bee shoulder. That was her Lorelei device. And it was just like
Yeah, like what if
insection.
that fly had its own Lorelei, which was another little fly or little bee and
Right.
going all the way up?
Yeah. So it's just like it was really ironic that was like an example in here, and then we had an insect actually, character concept, and then I also included it can be a glass orb, like a soothsayer's crystal ball. Like you can lean into the fantasy elements a little bit more too. So it's really however you envision that. So for your character, Kathleen, do you have any ideas of what the Lorelei would be like for your character?
Ooh, this is hard. So I think when I created my previous character, which is a character with the very thick goggles that could, I think, also function as a telescope, I think the goggles were the Lorelei, kind of like Google Glass, if anyone remembers Google Glass when it was a
Mm-hmm.
thing, like which is like the glasses that you could like look into and you can kind of see more information and do more stuff with. I feel like for this one, hmm, I know it's hard because you're trying to think like what would people have 100 years? in a future? Like,
Hmm.
my Lorelei, it could be, a smartphone? Would it be like an Apple Watch? I love the idea of like, a little fly or a pet. I mean, I personally love the idea of having like a little robotic like animal that follows me around, but is that too much as a spatial scout to have like another
Mm.
body to keep track of? Or maybe that's part of my whole lore. So, I'm just thinking out loud here. Okay, I have two ideas. So
Okay.
one would be like a little robotic pet, so not a fly, but maybe like
Mm.
I don't know, like a little like sheep or like a little dog hybrid.
Cute. I love
Yeah.
it.
Some sort of like a little fluffy animal. Or I love like sort of the more functional, like a smartwatch, just like a straightforward
Mm.
option.
Hmm.
Maybe it's like integrated into the power suit. So when I like, look at my wrist or do something, because I wanted to get away with it from the goggles because I did that in my previous character, but still some sort
Mm-hmm.
of like device that you could wear and like it's not Siri. Hopefully, it's not Siri in 100 years from now. But like, like whatever your name, Lorelei, like tell me, what
Hmm.
I see around you, and then my suit would speak to me. So yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know.
I
What does
love
chat
that.
think? Would you rather have a little animal or a little like smartwatch for my character? Oh my gosh, Silver says sheepdog. That'd be super cute. A little bumper
Yeah,
car kitten, the tail sticking straight up is really an antenna. That's also very, very
that's
cute.
so cute. I feel like when you ask, at least in my experience in tabletop, whenever people can acquire a pet, they always will. Like people just are drawn to like rescuing random creatures. I feel like my groups like we always like have to help the little animals and stuff. So yeah, and Kate says always, you always have to adopt a little. Everyone needs you need your team pet. So maybe that would be your research team's pet.
Yeah, well, I think this is sort of again sort of going back to your own individual play style. If you've played
Hmm.
other tabletop games or video games before, and then, it's okay if you haven't, but I find that in other games I've played, I always like being someone who can like summon other like friends to help
Mm-hmm.
me so I'm not alone. So when I played Skyrim, I was a conjurer and I would just like sit very, very far back because I was a scaredy cat while like, my friend did
Yeah.
all the work for me, when they were fighting or something. And same with like Baldur's Gate or even
Hmm.
in this new game I've been playing, Core Keeper. Like I summon little bats and skeletons to fight for me. So I like the idea of having a companion. Maybe if I
Hmm.
want to go back to the backstory, like the idea of I'm thinking about like a support animal, like when I was in the hospital or
Mm.
at home, like this was like my only
Hmm.
companion. So whether or not like I had a Lorelei from the beginning, or maybe I just always wanted someone to be like, like next to me. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so maybe like a little robotic animal type, not sure yet. So I'll just say um, small, I'll say robotic companion. Um, because it's robotic, I probably can't say fluffy unless they've like come up with a way
Why
to
not?
like maybe they do put
Yeah.
fluff over
Yeah.
the
Makes
robotics in
them
the
easier
future.
to cuddle.
Yeah, so a little bit like tough inside, but like yeah, maybe like soft on the outside. So I'll say yeah, I'll say fluffy on the outside, and I'll just say dog. I'll just say dog for now, just to make it to simplify things. I'll say I don't know, does dog bark or speak in English? Like I'm trying to think about how
Mm,
Lorelai would
hmm.
communicate to me. I'll say um, communicates through barking, but I understand. But I can understand its meaning.
Okay. Oh, I like that.
Yeah. I
Hmm.
also like the idea of maybe like other people, maybe like Loreleis are all in some sort of like network that connects. So even if you don't
Mm,
understand like other Loreleis, well, no, maybe they'll like translate it back to whoever my teammates are. I think that's what we did with the bee, because the bee connected
yeah.
through pheromones, I think, and
Yes.
buzzing. So it was like, how do you translate that to your teammates? And I think that's how something similar would be great.
Yeah. And I just Zara had put in the chat, like I was thinking of appearing as out of bad data tech, so I wouldn't break the prime directive. And that's something that came up during playtesting when we were playing one of the missions is do the people who you're basically communicating with in the missions know that you are from the future. And that is something, and I've actually had to write a little bit more kind of guidance on doing that within the game, because that's ultimately up to the groups, if they want to make that really obvious. Like if you're a bipedal robot and you have translucent skin and you're made of just like, mechanisms, it's hard to mask that unless you make efforts to do so, which might affect, how a character or how a person portrays their character. And also, like, what does that mean, from a gameplay perspective? Does that mean that all of the NPCs, like within the mission, like, are they limited to how much they can ask about the future? Like, because I don't necessarily want a session to be turning into like these fictional characters are asking the real players about things that happen in the future, as someone would probably want to do. Like if I met someone 100 years from the future, I would want to ask them all sorts of things. So there's had to kind of like add some information in there about how to facilitate that. So just another interesting takeaway from playtesting. But your comment made me think of all that. Well, I love your Lorelei, Kathleen. I think they're adorable. They must be protected at all costs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna.
So, yeah, any other details about so we can talk. So what we'll do, we'll just kind of, let's recap some of your character so far. Then we can do a little bit of talking about the research team things, just so folks know kind of how that works. And then we can maybe wrap up with the mission directive.
That sounds good.
Does that
Yeah.
sound good? Okay. So let's recap your character, Kathleen. What a neat character. You're playing a spatial scout, someone who's inspired by one of your descendants. Have you thought of any names or other backstory for them? You have a pretty rich story for them already.
Yeah, names are always honestly the hardest thing for me to come
Mm-hmm.
up with. I feel like I always go, it's either like it comes to me immediately like names first, or it's like names last.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to find this. I think when we were, Silver suggested possibly Star because they're going to reach the stars one day. And I
Mm.
was going to say, it's funny you mentioned that 'cause I think in the first session 0 I did, my character's name was Lulu Starseeker. So
Yep.
we're already on the same brain cell. For this one, and I love the moon and the stars. I'm just going to backtrack by saying
Mm-hmm.
when I took Mongolian in graduate school, we had to come up with a Mongolian name, and my
Mm.
Mongolian name was Moonlight. So I love space. So I'm just I will never be tired of space. I don't know. I think because I want to play as a non-binary character for this iteration of our session 0, I'm trying to think of maybe something that's like named after like a natural material, like maybe in the future,
Mm.
maybe a lot of things have been like mined away. Like let's say like in this future version of Nevada, maybe there's, not so many like precious gemstones or minerals left.
Mm.
So I'll just say, okay, I'm just sort of right again, brainstorming out loud. I don't
Mm.
know a last name. Or maybe they don't have a
Maybe we
last
don't
name.
have, yeah.
Yeah.
It's cool. You're like Beyonce, you know.
Yeah, I'll just be
She has
Emerald.
one, but it doesn't matter, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, Emerald. I
Yeah.
love it.
I've never watched Steven Universe, but this actually makes me feel like I'm playing like a Steven
Oh,
Universe
it's
character.
delightful.
So, okay, yeah, I'll just be Emerald, a non-binary descendant of mine from the future. Also, because it's
Love
my
it.
gem, like my birthstone, so I love the color green. So I'll just throwing that out there. Also,
Well,
Emerald.
that's perfect. Well, then that's also like they're connected to you, present you, through that kind of detail. That's cool. I mean, names are passed down in families. Other things can be, passed down. I think that's kind of a cool, maybe that's a tradition in
Hmm.
your character's family. There's so many little details that you could just do so much with. Yeah, I love it. Okay, Emerald, Spatial Scout. We have some cool kind of like we perceive their cool like power suit. And also when you're talking about power suit, it made me think of Fallout. I don't know if you have played or watched the Fallout show
I'm
is
on the
delightful
last
and it has
episode of
yeah.
the show.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the character who's just like traipsing around in his suit and like doesn't have the top on and just like
Yeah.
the fun proportions of that. Um a very loud footfall. I love how encumbered the spatial scout is.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you're encumbered, but not burdened, but you're encumbered. So you make a lot of sound, you run into things with gear, but you're still very astute at being able to navigate something. You can at least like scout out the area, but perhaps not necessarily like traverse it with with a lot of stealth, which
Hmm.
is perfectly fine. You have a faint odor of ancient spice, which I think is great. Um, so, normally at this point, we would be talking a little bit more about your team's dynamic here, which means like, how do all of your teammates like know each other? Have you been paired for this mission with researchers that you've never met? Are there any researchers that maybe you've collaborated with before? Is there a researcher that you just instinctively like just do not seem to like? You have your eyes on them, or they on you, and there's like like a natural rivalry there, or maybe there's someone that you just like really buddy up with immediately. Like we would be kind of discussing all of those things as a group to figure that out. Mostly because, like I said, if we are going to explore some of those inner party conflicts, that can be a lot of fun at the table. But you want to make sure that everyone's on the same page about it. It is not fun to play with someone who is your rival and you didn't realize it, and they're constantly like antagonizing you. Like it's okay for your characters to not know things. That's important. Like your characters should be acting as your characters, but you as people, it should never be a personal attack or kind of conflict there. So that's really important to establish, because some groups are really great about like just really knowing those boundaries. And sometimes if you're playing with new people, it might not feel super comfortable to do that just yet. So you would be kind of talking through all of those things and also making sure that the other players are okay with that. Like if two of the characters want to have a relationship, like everyone else kind of needs to be like okay with that being role played and explored, and to what level. So we would be talking about all those just different things that would come up. But you would also be talking about your research team name, if you have a name, if you want to have like a mission name, and go, have something really cool that sounds epic, or if that's something that just kind of comes naturally through your playtime together. I feel like in D&D, for the groups I usually play with, it usually takes us some time to figure out what our group name is going to be. It's usually inspired by something that we've done together, some shenanigans. So that might not be something that comes to mind immediately. And then your mode of transport. And like the lore loop itself, in this game, you can be as kind of like as weird and wacky with it as you want. Kathleen, are there any ways that you envision? I know we don't have like a group right now, but like how Emerald would maybe want to, you know, navigate through time and space to these different missions in Nevada.
Yeah, so I don't know, I'm trying to think like it's hard without the rest of the people around the table,
Right.
right? So, right, if we were doing this in real life with a large group, we would all be sort of discussing this together. But maybe, we could save this as, a session zero for a group, we'll do on stream in the near future. I think it'd be fun to grab
Yeah.
together a group of people and have us all play together and talk about this. Yeah, I'm thinking about earlier someone in chat was talking about a Subaru, which I love because I think in my work playtesting with my colleagues, I forget what kind of car it was, some sort of like
This is a
camper.
Winnebago.
Yeah, it was a Winnebago. So
Yeah.
that had like a whole bunch of stuff like strapped to it. So there's just
Yes.
something about these like cars that people love. Um,
Hmm.
Gosh, this is hard.
Yeah, I like Subaru. I like how we always kind of just come back to like, fairly like, but there is something charming about that, especially like, because I think if you're someone from the future, like we look at cars 100 years ago, there's a novelty there, about using things that are kind of like, old and from eras, bygone eras. So I love the idea of you like driving around just like, a 2024 Subaru, which by all accounts is a really nice car, but in 100 years, that would be like just it would feel very different,
Well, and
So I think that's a fun
that's the
concept.
question to you're asking, right? Like, do people in 2024 and you travel back there with your team, like, can we go in some like crazy, like futuristic thing? Like, do we want to
Hmm.
attract attention? Does it change when you go through the Loreloop? Does it sort of like take on its like past analog? Is it like a Cybertruck? Like, I don't know.
Right.
So. Yeah, how do we get around? I mean, I would say dog sled, but I don't think that's like very feasible. I just have this dream about someday everyone in the US will get around. We'll just go back to dog sleds and horse sleds. I think that would be really great. Less traffic accidents, hopefully. Um, Maybe we should do some sort of vehicle though. I think that would just make it easier for getting across terrain in
Hmm.
2024. This is like a hard question to ask me because I am not a car person at all. Like I don't know anything about cars. I like the idea of some sort of like hover bike. So maybe instead of like a vehicle that everyone is in, maybe we all have like the same, like maybe we're all in like roller skates or something. Or like,
Yeah,
I
I
kind of
love
love
it.
the idea. Just like we're in roller skates, but
Hmm.
maybe it's hidden so it looks, so we don't get tired. Like, we don't have like knee pains and knees popping out at the end of the day. So I would just
Yes.
say, I know I love the idea of hover Subaru, but
I
keeping
know.
in mind that we're from the future, but we're going back to like present day. I think for this iteration of Loreloop, I think that people would want to have modes of transportation that would sort of like fit right in and wouldn't attract like suspicion or people being like, where'd you get that hover Subaru? So,
Yeah, and it'll be really fun to see how groups kind of navigate that part of the game. Like, yeah, do they come back with just like this weird futuristic thing, like, um, or or do they try to kind of stay within what they know of this current era? And also maybe they do make that attempt to like basically mask as people from present day, but maybe they do so poorly, and it's like they're giving themselves away at every opportunity. So it'll be really cool to see how much that just changes from group to group. Hover Heelys. Yeah, I love all these ideas.
yeah.
And also just like given the nature of the game, like you are the way that you're going to these different missions is in itself very abstract and nebulous. It's like there's not, although you're going to areas of the state, every place that you're going to is in itself fictional. And also the missions themselves have very high levels of fantasy within them. And you're going into weird dimensions and things like that. So the nature of your transport can be kind of whatever. If you wanted to be dog sledding, I think you should definitely go with that. But I like the roller skating idea. I think that's pretty fun.
Power suit and roller skates.
Yeah. So, since we're getting to the end of our time here, I feel like this is a good kind of chance to start wrapping up what would be our session zero. So, yeah, as a group, we would be talking through more of those kind of final things just to kind of solidify like the group dynamic as it stands now. Obviously, that's going to change a lot as the campaign, or the adventure path is underway. But these are just fun things to talk about, but also just important things to make sure the experience is as good as possible. And then what I would be doing at this point is basically giving the group their mission directive. This is what would kick off the actual lore loop adventure path. When people play this game, you certainly don't have to play all of the missions. Like we hope that people will just kind of maybe drop in the missions as they can. There's 6 total. They do kind of connect together, like kind of with some overarching themes, and it does result in kind of this final thing about repairing the lore loop based off of what you've uncovered. But you don't have to do that. Still, I think it's fun to know the mission directive so you know kind of the greater purpose. So I will share what I would be sharing with my players, and then we can kind of do wrap up things. Okay. Thank you for joining me on this mission, researchers. The lore loop, which is the harmonious, evolving, cyclical place through which we all live and create, has been fractured, and pieces of it have gone missing throughout time and space. You have been enlisted to help restore the lore loop and ideally make it better. As a concept, the lore loop is designed as an evolutionary system. It will continue to grow and expand, reflecting the communities who maintain and contribute to it with their voices, actions, and creativity. It has taken an entire century to bring the lore loop to life. So to investigate the fracturing, we must go back 100 years to when the lore loop was first created. In our preliminary investigation of the issue, Mission Control has identified 6 missing pieces that we believe correspond with the missions on which you're about to embark. These pieces include intention, language, justice, memory, community, and change. Where these pieces went, I don't know, but we have traced threads of these pieces to 6 potential places and circumstances. The actual pieces will be uncovered based on your decisions and problem solving in each mission. As your director, I will not dictate your decisions, but I will relay outcomes and consequences. My role is to serve as a liaison to Loreloop's Mission Control, where we have received some requests from those who seek your help, and to shepherd you through this once-in-a-lifetime experience. Prior to each mission, I'll share the mission request and general overview so that you can prepare for it. Before we embark, let's discuss some of the logistics. And then we get into our first mission. So I feel like a pretty in-depth look into this game and the characters that you would be making and kind of what your goal is, what your objective is. Each mission has its own sub-objectives, but basically this is like the greater goal of the whole book. And if you do play all the missions or even some of them, it all culminates in this kind of like cool concluding event where you get to repair the lore loop and kind of set the stage for its future.
I'm so sad I can't keep playing.
I know.
Well, thank you so much for walking me through this, and I hope that future people who watch this might also find this helpful. It's possible I might even do another one of these on stream sometime. It's sort of my dream that at some point we'll get like an actual group of people to play through the story of Loreloop for you all, just as both like an educational programming online, but also as a guide or a resource for people who might want to start in the future. And sometimes I think it's helpful when you see other people playing the game before you sort of, feel, confident and comfortable enough to embark on it yourself. So I just put a link in a chat. So for people who want to, this is a little bit of a placeholder page for now. We're going to be updating it in the near future. But on the left, if you click the top link, you get sort of the quick start guide that we created for Free RPG Day back in June. And the bottom link, which says play testing information, is exactly that. So if you want to read any of the materials or documents that we have, you're welcome to do so. You can do that on that bottom link on our Loreloop page on the Nevada Humanities website. And yeah, we would just love to hear from any of you about either characters you made or thoughts you had as a result of today's stream or in the near future after watching a recording. We're going to start creating some pre-generated characters, and I don't know if you've already thought about their backstories, but if someone shares like a really fun idea and gives us permission, it might be fun to create a pre-generated character based on a design or an idea that you share with us. So I think the last thing that I wanted to get into before we end our stream today is maybe just to remind people that, this is a part of United We Stand Connecting Through Culture, which is a joint initiative between the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts to combat hate-based violence. And Ashley, I think we were talking about this a little bit before stream, but in like sort of coming up with the idea for Loreloop and in our time play testing with others, sometimes people have asked, why isn't there fighting or a combat system in this game? And I'm wondering if you'd just like to, briefly address that, because I think that plays, as part of the character design, people who are experienced with, D&D or other traditional games where there is that, combat element involved, it might ask, well, there's no fun, or what would I get out of this? So, but that's, sort of the opposite of what we're trying to do.
Sure. Yeah. And this has come up quite a few times in a lot of the conversations that I've had with people, especially folks who have, some familiarity with D&D. And even as a D&D player, I'm a huge fan of D&D. I love it. But I always like to question and push back a little bit on why we feel like violence is the fun part of a tabletop role-playing game. I'm not saying that it's not something that does add to the entertaining element of D&D. I think there's a lot of strategy and problem solving that goes into combat. I think it's fun for people to build characters with that kind of goal in mind. But ultimately, at the heart of our game is we want to question why violence has often been the solution for a lot of people and why people have thought that that's the only option. We delve into a lot of really complex history and themes and topics within Loreloop, and where violence is a part of it that we can't not talk about. But I think our actions as players does not need to be like instinctively going toward violence as problem solving. And I think when it comes to tabletop role playing games, there's so many other elements that make it so fun. It's fun to hang out with your friends. It's fun to make cool characters and think about futuristic elements and gear and items and what the world is going to be like in the future. It's cool to like travel back in time. Like there's a whole time travel thing here where you get to visit places that you might kind of recognize, as someone who might live in Nevada or, wherever you live, and we'll be playing, Loreloop. And so, and also like within gaming itself, when we think of even video games, violence is often like kind of a core part of a lot of games, but that has changed a lot. And even within the games that we think of as very violence heavy, there's a lot of other objectives there. And same within Loreloop. Like there's a part in one of the modules that I was just working on where you have to get out of a mine shaft very quickly, otherwise it's going to collapse. And there's a a timed element there, and you have to problem solve and you have to get out of there. And that doesn't have to do with violence. That's not fun because you're fighting something or trying to kill something. And so there's a lot of ways to have fun at the table that don't involve violence. And I just want us all to be thinking really critically about why we feel like that's a necessary part of games. And if we do find that fun, like what really informs that part of it for us. Because I don't believe that has to be intrinsic to games as a genre, including tabletop. And I think in Loreloop, it's something that I want everyone to really be thinking about. And I have as well, just when I'm thinking about game design, like what am I doing to like maybe inadvertently encourage some maybe not I don't know, not good gameplay, even with like character building. Like, what am I doing as a designer to foster a sense of belonging and inclusivity and thoughtfulness in the games themselves? So that's kind of my perspective on violence and tabletop. That's a huge topic, but since it's come up a lot lately in some of the conversations that we've been having, and it's come up in playtesting, it's something that I think we can just kind of continue to have a dialogue about.
I really appreciate all of that, Ashley. And yeah, so thank you for everyone today in our chat for joining us. We just had such a wonderful, lively, supportive chat. So thank you all so much for being here. And I just in closing our stream, I just wanted to again remind everyone that this program and Loreloop, which is our original tabletop role playing game and collection of interactive stories that are set in Nevada, this was made possible with funding by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the United We Stand Connecting Through Culture National Initiative. As I mentioned, we are currently play testing Loreloop, so there are different ways that we'd love to just get people's input and feedback before the game is finalized at the end of this year. And again, this will be made free and available on the Nevada Humanities website. I think maybe we'll even put it on Drive Through RPG, Ashley, and other places that you can think of. So I defer to Ashley and like sort of all things like promotion, where to share where to spread the news. But for those of you who are either based in Nevada or even if you're outside of Nevada, we have a lot of online and in-person programs. So you can always go to our website, nevadahumanities.org, if you want to keep up with, what we might have coming up next, whether it's in person or online, such as upcoming Humanities at Play streams. And if you have time, we do have a survey that I always appreciate people taking. So if you have ideas, I want to see more Loreloop on stream. Like I want Ashley to come back and play this like game, and I want to get her thoughts on that. You can put that in a survey. So fill that out, and we'd love to see what you think. And then finally, we do have a YouTube channel for Nevada Humanities where we put a lot of archived recordings of our past events. So if you were watching today, or if you came in halfway through and want to find out what you missed, you could either watch the Twitch recording, which will be up for a week, or you can watch that YouTube link when it's up later on. So those are just a couple ways that we'd love to stay in touch with all of you. And again, it's just been such a supreme pleasure to have been working with Ashley so closely over like the last year and a half on this project. And I'm very, very excited to see where this takes us in the near future. So yeah, I hope, don't be a stranger, come back again and chat, come back to, even if you're not doing a Loreloop stream, you're all welcome to come and hang out with us on Humanities at Play. And yeah, I would love to think about doing a Loreloop, like actual like playthrough sometime in the near future. And Ashley and I will discuss that. So yeah, do you have any other thoughts, Ashley, before we say goodbye to everyone today?
I don't think so. I would just say, like, yeah, keep an eye on the Nevada Humanities website. It's including our Loreloop page. And you can also go to my website, which is scribemind.com. I'm going to be posting some more updates about Loreloop. But I'm doing some cool things with the literary crawl this year here in Reno that may or may not be Loreloop related. I don't want to say anything because we're still planning some things. But yeah, just keep an eye out there. So if you are going to be in Reno in October and thinking about participating in the literary crawl, I hope that I will have a chance to see you there.
Wonderful. Well, have a wonderful rest of your days, and we'll see you all very, very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.